Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Henry Lucas. I'm chairman of the Warwickshire Rural Hub. Firstly, a little bit of housekeeping. As you can see on your screens, or hopefully you can see them, if you would like to ask a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A function. That's the only way you'll be able to raise a question. If you need basis points or Moroso points, the reference is on the screen now. Well, this morning's webinar on Syngenta's Conservation Agriculture Project looks like a very interesting session. So I'm not going to keep you long. I'm just going to introduce the two presenters today. Firstly, Belinda Bailey, who probably a lot of you know. She comes from Warwickshire, Syngenta's Sustainable Farming Manager, and also Dr. Nathan Morris from NIAB TAG. So that's about all you're going to get from me, and I'll hand you straight over to the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, and good morning, everybody. Let me just change the slides. Okay. Great. Well, yes. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for the Rural Hub for inviting us to come and present a project that we've been running now for a number of years. So this is the Conservation, Agriculture and Sustainable Farming Systems project. Quite a mouthful. This project, we started conversations back in 2016, along with our partners NIAB and GWCT, the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust here in the UK, and our other key main partner within the project is ECAF, the European Conservation Agriculture Federation. We started the project it's a European project, and we started with ourselves here in the UK, in France and in Spain. And what we wanted to do was look at the conservation agricultural principles in a predominantly cereal-based cropping rotation, trying to understand the outcomes from that, so we can perhaps help support a quicker adoption of it and make it more reliable for growers. More recently, as we have progressed through the project, we have now got other countries involved, like Denmark, Germany, Romania, Hungary, and Portugal as well. What we've got here in the UK, we have two sites. We started the first site at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust farm at Loddington, the Allerton project. This farm is based in Leicestershire and is predominantly a sort of a heavy land site, quite a high elevation above sea level, with the main sort of concern on the farm and where the decisions are made around is the blackgrass control, so the blackgrass issues that they have. We started in the first year, the autumn of 2017 at Loddington as a bit of a pilot year to make sure that what we were doing worked. We looked at the measurements that we were doing. Are they the right ones? Did we need to adjust them? And during that first year, we then sought out our second site, which is with Andy Barr down in Kent. This site was chosen because Andy has been practicing conservation agriculture for many years, transitioned across sort of 10, 15 years ago, and is much more of a light land site, so doesn't have blackgrass as his main driver to his cropping decisions and input decisions. So Andy's now been on board for 3 years as well, and we've just completed our fourth year at Loddington. So what are we looking at? What we're doing is looking at three systems. So we've got the plough as our sort of baseline standard. We know that many small farmers are still predominantly ploughing, and then we move across to direct drill, where much more of the larger farms have moved in that direction. So conventional, we're ploughing up to a 15 to 20 centimetre depth. We then have our first sustainable system, and this is where we're doing more minimal cultivation to a depth of sort of 10 to 15 centimetres. And we're also including green cover crops within that system. With the plough-based system, we're not bringing cover crops into that rotation. And then our sustainable system 2, this is more of a direct drill, or we name it sort of light till at Loddington, because at the moment quite difficult to just do a simple direct drill. So we might have a straw rake or a light cultivation within that, whereas down at Andy Barr's in Kent, it is very much a direct drill. So how have we laid this out? We are working within the farm's rotation. So this is just an example here from Loddington. They picked out 5 fields that would be suitable. So a fairly uniform field where we could lay these 3 different systems alongside each other. So there you can see we have the plough here. We have then the min till and the light till, and we're working on at least 48 metres wide. And here at Loddington, we're running the length of the field. So that's how it's set up. It's all at farm scale rather than a small plot trial level. These are the rotations that we have been working on. So at Lenham, it was set out, we are actually working in 5 fields. So it is actually a 5-year rotation, but because Lenham came on board a year late, we have 4 fields. And then also the 5th field, it's a tenanted field. And there was a concern at the start of the project that we might lose it. So we didn't want to include all the 5 crops and then lose one halfway through. So we're working on a 5-year rotation, but within the 4 fields. And you can see here basic of a winter wheat. We've got winter oilseed rape, and then we have 2 spring crops here. So ahead of the spring crops, we will put a green cover crop in the 2 sustainability systems. And you can see here we pretty much have been able to stick to that cropping rotation. At Loddington, based around winter barley, this is hybrid barley, Syngenta's Hyvido. We've got winter oilseed rape, spring beans as the break crop with the green covers beforehand, and then 2 winter wheats. And you can see in the first 2 years we stuck quite nicely to that rotation, and then I think the wheels fell off a little bit with the wet autumn of 2019 and not a great autumn 2020 either. And you can see the rotations cropping was had to be adjusted, but Nathan will pick up on that in a bit as we go through. So what are we looking at? Over the course of the 5 years of this project, we're going to have over 8,000 data points. So we've now reached the end of year 4. So we do have an incredible amount of data that we have been looking at. And today we're going to share with you the updated results. We have just finalised all the 2020-21 season. So a lot of number crunching has just been going on recently, and you're seeing the results for the first time. So what are we measuring? We're looking at agronomy. So here we're measuring things like crop establishment, we're looking at weed populations, we're looking at pests, and if we pick up any difference in diseases, that will also be measured. We're also looking at the nutrient in soil levels, and we're using our normal agronomic practices with crop protection and fertiliser inputs there. Going on to field operations, here we are measuring the time it takes to do our cultivations within the systems, the cost of those operations, the fuel use, to help us build up a picture of the efficiencies we might see going towards a more sustainable system compared to conventional. We're obviously then measuring the productivity. So we're measuring yield and also any quality traits. We need to see if there's any differences between those systems with any of the quality outputs from the crop as well. I'll just skip complexity and move on to profitability. So here then we're taking all the costings from the field operations or the agronomic inputs and coming out with so the bottom line profitability on the different systems. Through the sustainability, we're measuring a number of things, mostly around soil health, but also we're measuring farmland birds. So during the winter months, the 6 months throughout winter, transects are walked across each system on both sites, and farmland birds are counted on the numbers that are utilised in those different plots. On the soil health aspect, we're measuring quite a wide range of things, from earthworms, from the biological activity through using the tea bag test. We are measuring soil gas emissions. We're also measuring soil strength and soil structure as well, so giving us a good indication of how the soil health has been impacted from those systems. Okay, so I'm going to just cover some of the summary results from the sort of the food production side, the costings, profitability, etc. And then I will hand over to Nathan, who's going to go into more detail around agronomy and some of those soil results, and how the weather has a big play into some of these results that we're picking out. So I think the headline statement here, and probably the most important bit to farmers, is that net profit. And what we have done, we've split out the two different sites because they are quite different, with the light land here at Lenham and the heavy land site at Loddington. And what we have concluded is we are seeing an increase in profit when we compare that direct drill system to the plough-based system. So here we've taken out the min-till. It seems to be, and you'll see as I go through some results, very much sort of the middle ground. So we're here, all these infographics are comparing that direct drill against the plough-based system. And we've got 3 years of Lenham data and 4 years of Loddington. Interesting here, you can see more profitability at Lenham compared to Loddington. And when we compared this last season, we've had a slight increase from including this 2021 data. How do we come to that net profit? We looked obviously at yield. And this is quite interesting here at Lenham. We've seen now that average over the 3 years that we've got a slight increase in yield from direct drilling compared to plough. But if we went back the year before, where we'd only got 2 years of data, we were actually seeing a 3% yield reduction at that point. And it's as we go through, we can demonstrate where we have seen the change in the direct drill here in Lenham has actually got now, on average, a slightly higher yield. Loddington, a slightly different story. I'm sure not that unsurprising that on a heavy land site, we still find that the conventional on average is producing a higher yield than the direct drill, and we're about 7% difference. So a 7% reduction in yield by direct drilling, light tilling. And that has an impact on the sort of grain margin. So this here is giving us the result of the revenue minus the operational costs. But when we take into net profit, we see a swing, and I'll explain that in a short while. And then just highlighting some of the savings that we're seeing that help us to get to that net profit. Fuel use on both sites, very consistent. We can improve our fuel use by sort of just over 45%. Our work rate is increasing by nearly half, and that becomes more important as labour challenges may come forward, higher costs, or actually finding labour, or as farms are expanding and having greater hectares, it means we can cover the land better, and it might mean a difference of actually managing to get all the crops drilled in autumn or not. So, a good improvement there on work rate. And then the operational costs as well. We're seeing improvements here of operational costs. you see Lenham not quite as efficient as Loddington, but as you go through, we can see that Lenham is more of a high input, high output system, whereas Loddington they're managing their costs that much more because potential yields are not so high. So let's just look at some of these numbers that are behind those infographics. So the field operations, looking at just the number of passes that we do in a season. So this first graph, we've got the blue bars, orange and grey. So the blue's the conventional here, the plough. The sustainable system one are the orange bars, and the grey one's the sustainable system 2, which is your light till direct drill. And all the following slides are set up in the same way, so hopefully you can remember what we're looking at. Total operations here in Lenham is slightly higher, as I've just mentioned. It is slightly a more higher input farm compared to Loddington. So these are the total through the season, the number of passes that it is taken to produce the crop. And then this figure here is showing the number of operations that we do before drilling. So we can really break down the systems here of what we're doing at establishment. And then the work rates here as well, the work rate through the whole season and then before seeding. And you can see here consistently on both sites that as we move from conventional down to sustainable system 2, that we're seeing fewer operations and obviously more efficient work rate then. If we then move on to fuel use, I mentioned that we're saving sort of up to 50% on fuel use, and here you can see the breakdown of how we've got to those figures. Here, just an example, I've got last year's data from Lenham and the crops that we had, and so you can just have a look across on the different crops, but generally you can see quite a clear trend here on Lenham on the fuel use as a complete rotation, and there just looking at the fuel use needed to the establishment of the ground before drilling. And obviously here, you know, very little fuel is needed at Lenham, much lighter site. So I'm sure that, again, no surprises when we compare the two sites, that Lenham generally is using about 10 litres more per hectare of fuel compared to Loddington, but the trends there are the same. Then next, if we move on to the mechanical operations. So here what we're looking at is the costs of the establishment and the cost of the total operations. So that's the machinery passes and the cost for that. And those costs are gained from the CAAV costings rather than the individual farms. So we've got a comparison. And again, you can see that those savings from moving from a plough to that direct drill, that we see a drop in those mechanical operations, particularly around the establishment phase. You can see here there's quite a good reduction in cost. And then when you compare that, the Lenham and the Loddington sites together, you can again see the trends are very similar and the costs obviously are very similar. So the operations are very, very similar. So we're out at about £300 per hectare on the mechanical operations through the season on both sites for plough. And then just coming in at around £240 a hectare for the sustainability. But those mechanical operations, you can see just over £100 to get the field ready for planting on a plough, and then around £40 per hectare. So a considerable saving there. If we look at the operational costs, these are the total costs, and the input costs. What we've done with this project is actually put the same input costs across all three systems. So the fertiliser and crop protection products have been the same across all three systems. The reason that we've done this is because what we wanted to do is really look at the three systems. And if we started to put variable inputs on as well, we'd get too many variables for us to really be able to pick out system differences. So what you'll see here is, although we've got those savings from the machinery costs, the operational costs, so those input costs, are very similar across the three systems. So when we look then at our total operating costs, those big differences are not seen, but we are still seeing those savings. And from those infographics I showed you earlier, it's sort of 5% at Lenham and 10% at Loddington. And these are the results showing. So really, input costs, we're around £700 per hectare at Lenham, as I've mentioned before, a slightly higher input-output system. And at Loddington, those operational costs are slightly less. And that's manageable because the outputs, the yields are not so high. But again, just that clear trend there of the efficiency from and saving from moving to a sustainable system. But hopefully, as we progress the project, we come to the end of this 5-year project, this harvest coming. What we'd like to do is to progress the project further, and this is something that we would like to address is looking at where there might be opportunities to adjust some of the input costs that are going across the systems. If we look at then the yield, so the output from these crops, here I've just got the averages of a complete system for Lenham and for Loddington. And you can see the yearly differences that we're seeing, and that the seasons do tend to just slightly change the trends that we've seen. So in 18-19 at Lenham, very, very little difference in yield output from across all three systems. In 19 and 20, the conventional had the edge, and just across the rotation was producing slightly more. But then this last season, we can see the inverse here. And again, we'll explain, there was one crop particularly here that's really pushed that difference from the last season. So when we average it across, we are seeing now with that 3% increase in output compared to the conventional. And then at Loddington, a slightly different story here. Again, yes, the variability, you can see the different seasons and the total yields that we've been getting. If we remember these two seasons, we were very much autumn sown cropping with the one spring barley. And then moving on to both 19-20, we were completely spring cropped. And then this past season, it was mostly spring cropped as well, due to the difficult conditions in the autumn that was experienced at Loddington. And what we're finding generally here then at Loddington, that the pattern that the plough is producing the highest of the yields, and also slightly back on what Lenham is achieving. Then if we look at the revenue, so obviously all we've done here is looked at the yields and multiplied that up by the grain prices. What we've got here, slight change in what we're looking at. We've got high, medium and low. And what we're looking at here is actually the grain prices. So what we wanted to do, this is part of looking at the resilience of the systems in the fluctuating of grain prices. So what we do is look at the AHDB UK delivered prices for the season, and we take the median. We also then take the high spot price and we take the low spot price and see how that has an impact on the revenue, and then moving on to look at the margin and net profit. So here you can see in that first in the winter oilseed rape, this is an average across the seasons where we've grown winter oilseed rape. You can see here with the revenue, we're ahead on sustainable system 2 at all the grain prices compared to conventional. And then here we've averaged the wheat, the winter wheat across the different seasons. So we've probably got 4 or 5 wheat crops in here. which is giving us our average figures, and obviously is giving Andy the highest revenue crop here. Spring beans slightly back, spring barley here, you can see that, and then spring peas, and then we've just got the average across the three systems and the revenue there. And then the same we've done for Loddington. We've got all the different crops that we've had throughout the project so far. Some of these have only been a 1 year cropping, like spring oats. So that's just the 1 year of output, whereas the winter wheat and winter barley will have 2 or 3 seasons with those. And again, highlighting obviously the most profitable, the highest income is being derived from the winter wheat. Spring beans, unfortunately, at Loddington, there's been some challenging years for spring beans, and we're waiting for the good year. We know we've had a number of poor years. We seem to have hit those, and hopefully we can. Things have gone in well this autumn, so fingers crossed for a better year this year, I think. If we then look at that on margin and net profit, so here again, I've just as an example at Lenham, last year's data on the margin that we've calculated. So margin is looking at the operational costs taken away from the revenue. Spring barley has done well, that the yields were slightly higher for the sustainable system too, so an improved margin. So the margin there is at £700 per hectare, and you're down to about 620, I think it is, for the conventional. Here, spring peas didn't do so well. That will have come to the dry spring and the establishment time for those. The winter oilseed rape, this is where we had a huge impact, and Nathan will pick up on that for us. So yeah, the winter wheat's coming out well. And then the complete rotation, this is the margin. So we can see here the improvement from the sustainable system too. Then we've actually calculated here a net profit. So what we've done here is actually started to take into consideration the capital costs. This was really discussed was when Phil Jarvis was still at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. He, felt, and definitely at Loddington, when we look at those results, that if we are going to move to a more sustainable system, we're going to have to look at our capital costs, particularly with BPS going as well over the next few years. But it is something that we need to address. It's not just the inputs and what we're doing in the field, but actually looking at our capital costs as well. So what we did, we sent Andy and Phil away to look at the capital costs, see what savings they felt they would have spread across the duration of the project, so 5 years, suggesting that if we move from a conventional to the sustainable system 1, so that min-till, we could actually remove a cultivator. And then when we move to sustainable system 2, we could actually remove a tractor and a cultivator. So what in capital terms did that mean? And they came out with very, very similar prices that they're suggesting that, there would be a saving of £50 a hectare if they removed a cultivator from their capital. And then for sustainable system 2 of removing a tractor and a cultivator, they can, that's a tractor, and then a tractor and a cultivator, they can reduce that by £65. So that then, when you put those into consideration, it extends the profitability here on the Lenham site compared to just looking at the operational costs. So what we've got here is the Lenham, the margin across the seasons for us, with the average here, with the 3 different grain prices. So referring back, we've got the high, medium and low grain cost, and then the net profit, and obviously a very similar picture on the margin and the net profit here at Lenham, but as I say, just it expands that profitability as you move across to the sustainable system. Slightly different story at Loddington. What we're finding, there's more variation. There seems to be more impact from the weather with the systems, and as you move across, looking at the margin, that we are finding more often than not that the plough-based system does come out slightly on top. We have seen, and it's quite clear, that that min-till here at Loddington is not doing anything. You've still got fairly high input costs, but then you can have that yield penalty, and that's sort of dragging that sustainable system one down. So yeah, for Loddington, you've either got to plough or you've got to really be challenged to move to more of a direct drill system to gain the financial benefits from it. But you can see here that the two, the plough and the sustainable system, are very, very similar. But when we start to take into those consideration the capital costs, we can see here that then the advantage of that more direct drill system. So we do see more of a change here rather than an expansion that we are seeing at Lenham. So that really, from me, is all I was going to say around the costings and some of the financial, time-saving, etc. Aspects that we are getting from the project. So I'm going to now hand over to Nathan. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Nathan, and hand over to you.
Okay. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. I was going to take you through some of the sort of factors we're seeing around those drivers of sort of production and profitability within the systems, mainly on what we're sort of labelling as the environmental sort of sustainability of the systems, looking at mainly around soil and also sort of biodiversity in terms of bird sightings. And as Belinda's explained about the two sites we have in the UK, we have the light land at Lenham and the heavier soil type at Loddington. And just some highlight sort of headline figures around these bird sightings. We can see that transitioning from a conventional plough-based system to the sustainable system 2, we do see large increases in the bird sightings at both sites, particularly at Loddington. And when we look at earthworm numbers also, we see that increase in their populations at both sites, but again, Lenham having a bigger impact, and I'll come through that in a bit more detail in due course. We also look at the greenhouse gas emissions from the soil at both sites, and we can see there that we again, transitioning through to a sustainable system 2, we see reductions in those emissions overall, but again, there is some differences between the two sites that I'll go into. And then if we're looking at the carbon footprint, so that's basically the emissions from the sort of production side. So that's the operations and it's the inputs. And this is calculated on a one season, but as Belinda explained, because the inputs, we don't change between systems, we expect this to be similar across the seasons. So we're seeing a reduction in overall carbon footprint of the system 2 compared to a conventional. So if we just move on into a little bit of detail about the seasons. So this is the weather data from the site at Lenham over the 3 seasons. We have the rainfall with the monthly average for that season, and then the long-term mean for 2 of the seasons. So we can see here, this was a relatively typical season in 2019 for rainfall. When we went into 2020, we had more rain in the autumn and a wetter winter than the previous season. And then, as we know, the last 2 seasons, we've had those sort of extremes really of wetter winters, but then turning drier in the spring. And that obviously always is a challenge for growers when conditions turn from one extreme to another. It's not obviously very easy to get crops in the ground when soil's very wet, and then when it turns dry and bakes hard, that can equally be a challenge. So these systems do start to pull or tease apart when we see that impact from the weather. And then again in 2021, we've probably had a little bit more of a normal season, but a wetter autumn. And then again, April was exceedingly dry with barely any rainfall recorded. In terms of crop establishment, again at Lenham, we look at the rotation there, predominantly winter based with spring breaks for pulses in the barley. And we look at the germination. So that's basically comparing the actual seeds sown per square metre to actually the plant populations counted to get the establishment figure. We can see there on average that between systems, the plough does produce on average the highest establishment. And again, in the 2021 season, we got quite a reduction. And again, we can look at that in terms of the, particularly the winter oilseed rape was quite heavily affected. And although in the conventional system, we actually got good establishment initially from the conventional sowing, unfortunately, due to various pressures, so it turned particularly dry. And also the flea beetle came in and just hammered the crop. So unfortunately, when we came to spring, we went back to the field and we had a look, and we'd lost the entire crop from their conventional system. And as Belinda mentioned, that obviously does heavily play on the sort of margins and financial performance. But it is a real dilemma now for farmers facing: do they include oilseed rape in their rotation? And obviously, what impact do the systems have? And clearly here we see system 1 slightly better, but still heavily impacted. We had about 50% impact from flea beetle on populations, and the sustainable system 2 showing the sort of strongest plants and establishment. But again, it did have an impact, and the margin in the oilseed rape in the 2021 season was obviously affected from that.
Nathan, sorry, just to cut in the question from Tony in the chat, just asking what soil analysis or yield mapping was made before sort of starting the project. I don't know if you or Belinda want to just cover that off, just to give a bit of set the scene.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the soil analyses, we do every season we look at the soil nutrients and nitrogen status. But at the outset of the project, we also looked in the autumn at all the nutrients to make sure the indices were sufficient for the crops grown. And in terms of the sort of yield mapping, we use the yield maps. So both farms have yield mapping capabilities on their combine. They're both calibrated each season, and we use those yield maps to determine the yields from those systems. The weed burden at Lenham is we're lucky in the fact it's a lightland site. We do not get grass weeds, we don't get black grass. So in that sense, it's a relatively easy site. So most of the weed counts that we observe are more broadleaf weeds and volunteers. So particularly in these crops, we see volunteers in the wheat plants from the previous cropping, but very much controlled by the herbicide program. So they never really have a big impact on the performance of the crops. At Loddington, obviously on the heavier land site, the weather obviously also is a big driver to some of the impacts that we see. And as Belinda's mentioned, particularly the 2019 going into 2020 season was particularly challenging. So we can see in the autumn of 2019 and harvest as well, we had higher rainfall, and that progressed right through the autumn of 2019. So as Belinda mentioned, establishing the crops was a real challenge, and the winter crops failed, and we had to go into spring cropping. And then again, the challenge here, again, you can see there in February, we had a particularly wet month, nearly 100 millimetres of rain. And then it suddenly turned so dry, and April and May barely recorded any rainfall. So, these challenges really do start to tease out the performance of the systems and the impacts that can have on both crop and obviously soil measures that we're looking at. So at Loddington, we also look at the establishment, and again we can see there with the rotation how we've had what we on the outset of a winter-based cropping programme with the spring breaks, moving more predominantly to the spring cropping in these latter years because of the weather impact, not allowing us to establish the winter crops as we were planning to do so. And again, you can see there that the seasonal effect of the weather particularly again in the 2020 season, does have an impact on the establishment. And again, in the sustainable systems 1 and 2, we do see a reduction in the overall establishment of those crops, with the conventional being a little better than the other systems. But one of the challenges that we do see at Loddington, which, as I say, Lenham's lucky we don't get grass weeds, but at Loddington, it being a heavy land site, we are more susceptible to populations of grass weeds, particularly blackgrass. And this basically, we're just looking at the populations over the time period of the project in each of the 5 fields. So on the left-hand side, we have 3 of the fields where actually the populations of grass weeds are relatively low, particularly at Collie Top. Numbers are particularly low, haven't really caused too much of a concern. Slight increase at Cubbon South, and then a bit of an increase again in 2019 at Cawthorne, where blackgrass numbers were around about 50 plants per square metre, but manageable levels. What we've seen in the 2 other fields with greater pressures basically on grass weeds. So Upper Pond North started off, particularly in the conventional system, of having a high population of blackgrass, and that's been declining in more recent years. But perhaps of more concern recently is in Holloways, where we've had very low levels in the initial 3 years of the project, and then we've had this sort of increase, particularly in the last season, going from very low levels to quite high levels that will impact on crop performance. And that is partly, again, driven with the rotation. We had to switch from a winter wheat into spring wheat, and then we went into a winter barley. And because of that autumn of 2020 being a difficult autumn, the winter barley, although hybrid, didn't really establish to its capacity as we would normally expect, and it left quite an open canopy that obviously favoured the blackgrass. So, it's always a challenge at these sites or at these heavy land sites to sort of manage the crops as best we can to obviously, a strong crop that can outcompete the grass weeds is obviously sort of where we'd like to be. But the weather does obviously make that kind of challenging in given seasons. So when we're looking at sort of some of the soil measures in terms of sustainability, one of the factors we wanted to look at was the sort of strength of the soil and what impact that has on rooting potential. And obviously, if roots are limited, that can limit their both water and nutrient uptake, which obviously has an impact on the crop performance. So we use a soil penetrometer, which is basically just a narrow cone that we push through the soil and basically measure the resistance or the pressure of that. And that mimics the passage of a root through the soil. We can see here at Lenham in the 3 seasons, what we've done here is we've looked at the root restriction relative to 1.5 megapascals being 100%, and at 1.5 megapascals, we believe that's sort of the start of root restriction, and anything sort of above 2.5 to 3 megapascals would be sort of more likely to restrict root growth quite strongly. And we can see here in the initial year that the conventional system was much less strong than the other 2 systems, but both all 3 systems were reasonably able to allow roots to grow down to about 25 centimetres with very little restriction. And as you go through the soil profile, it obviously does get a bit stronger because it's below the cultivated, or generally below the cultivated layer. In 2019-20, it was a really difficult season. It turned very dry. And unfortunately, we were slightly late probably in the measurements, and actually the soil was probably drier than it would normally be. And obviously when soil's dry, they actually become stronger. So this probably is a reflection of that. And then in the 2021 season, we see again a similar trend to the outset of the project, where the conventional is a bit looser and less strong than the sustainable systems. But again, we're seeing probably a slight tightening of the soil with the sustainable systems now becoming sort of restricted with root at around 17.5 centimetres. And that's not atypical of these systems where you're doing low disturbance. You know, the soils do become a little bit stronger. And although we're using 1.5 megapascals as a sort of indicator, there's no sort of absolute value. And these are point measures. So this is taken at one day. And obviously as the soil's wet and dry, that does affect the strength of the soil. So basically soils that are wet are much less strong, and roots are able to grow through more easily. There are upsides of stronger soil as well. So if you think about your machine and the weight of the machine, the trafficability of those machines on the soil that are slightly stronger actually can aid its travel. So obviously if the soil is very wet, and you run a machine over, you're likely to get sink in. On a slightly more supportive soil, it holds that machine and it enables it to travel. So it's one of those measures where on its own, it doesn't necessarily have either a negative or positive, but it's one of those measures that does help us understand what might be driving the crop performance.
Nathan, sorry, just a quick question come in. Given the influence of weather conditions on many of the factors, how long will the trial continue to average out conditions?
So that's one of the benefits of having these projects that run for multiple years, is we do see the trends in a given year, but we can also look at the longer term trends as well, and get a bit of an understanding. But a lot of the sort of soil trends can be quite slow to change. So having a project that can run for 5 years will really allow us to tease out those general trends, and hopefully take out or at least acknowledge those seasons that are more difficult. So at Loddington, we see soil strength again, generally being a little bit softer than at Lenham, and that's likely with the soil type generally holding on to more moisture and being a little bit easier for roots to penetrate. But again, we can see the sort of transition across the seasons, very similar levels at the outset of the study in year 1, and then as we progress through the seasons, we do see a slight shift, and with the more recent season, the Sustainable System 2 having a slightly stronger soil at a slightly shallower depth than at the outset. So the one sort of 0.5 megapascal in 2021 was reached at about 22.5 centimetres. Back in that first year, we were about 32.5 centimetres. So there's a slight tightening of the soil, but as I say, that's not uncommon in low disturbance systems where you're generally not moving the soil as you would in a conventional based system. In terms of soil organic matter, we've also been monitoring this, and I'm sure as many of you are aware, soil organic matter is quite an important measure to be looking at in terms of the drivers for soil health, soil function. Obviously, it's very important for aggregation, so the structure of the soil, also how nutrients bind. Soil organic matter helps bind the nutrients to the soil, so retaining nutrients rather than losing it through to watercourses, and of course structurally as well, and the workability of the soil, the friability of the soil is also driven by organic matter. But organic matter does take a long time to build up. It's not something that happens very quickly, but our systems in terms of tillage over a long period of time, we know that basically the more tillage you do, the more oxidation that you drive basically, and therefore the greater losses of organic matter. And that's certainly over sort of the 50 years you can see post World War II with the ploughing up of grasslands. That 50-year period was obviously a very good indicator to show what happens when you transition to arable and you start cultivating soil and you oxidize that organic matter that was bound in the soil from a grass-based system. But in arable production, in a shorter term, we don't really see those differences. So here you can see how, although we're monitoring them each year, we don't see much change in organic matter between the systems at either of the sites. What you will notice is that organic matter obviously is very dependent on soil type, as in the capacity of a given soil to hold on to organic matter. So lighter soils always have lower organic matter than a heavier clay soil. And therefore, when we're talking about organic matter, it's something I always reiterate. It's very important that you're not necessarily comparing to your neighbour or to a farm on a different soil type, because it's you can't really compare. What is important is you look at your farm to actually look at the differences, the relative differences in your own farm and between potential production systems to see how that can change. We also look at earthworms because they are a very good indicator of biological activity, and particularly in the sustainable system 1 and 2, where, as we mentioned, we use cover crops before the spring breaks. They obviously help as well as a cover for the soil and protect the soil from rainfall and slumping, but they also obviously are a food source for the worms in terms of their when they're destroyed. And earthworms obviously also are driven by the disturbance as well. So obviously in a conventional based system with ploughing, you are likely to have a bigger impact on worm numbers than you are from a lower disturbance sustainable system 1 and 2. And that's quite clear at Lenham in the 3 years we've had. We can see that in 2 of those 3 years, there's lower levels in the conventional than in the sustainable system 1 and 2. As mentioned in an earlier slide when we looked at soil strength, that 2020 season also being very dry in the spring also limited our ability to look at the worms. Obviously, when it's very dry, they're a bit like slugs. They go away and hide and try and keep in a moist environment, which basically means they go down to depth and are harder to observe. But in the other seasons, we see this increase in the sustainable systems. So on average, we can see these populations are higher in those systems. What you do note at Lenham is that there are fewer functional, so these are basically counts by functional groups. So you have the three functional groups, so the surface dwellers of the epigeic, endogeic are the sort of below ground, but sort of still near the surface for cycling the crop material. And then you have the anisic, which are the deep burrowing species. And you can see there those you can only identify as adults. So adult worms were relatively low at Lenham, and the main counts were really with the juveniles. At Loddington, you can see that there's a much greater proportion of endogeic species, particularly in sustainable system 1, and that was reflected in nearly every season. And you can see that's probably what's driving the overall. So at Loddington, we see a slightly different pattern. We see that sustainable system 1 has the highest populations in worms overall, and that we think is due to the sort of disturbance that we do in that cultivation system, probably allowing there to be more material for the worms being incorporated into the surface or the sort of upper layers of the soil where those worms predominate, and it's probably aiding their populations. So moving on to biological activity. So we mentioned we used a teabag index to measure basically the activity of the soil, and particularly the bacterial and fungi populations. So we basically bury tea bags for a set amount of time, and then we dig them up and weigh them, and we can calculate the loss of the actual tea within those tea bags to look at basically how much the organic matter is being cycled, but also stored in the soil. And this is basically just an indicator of the two sites. So Lenham is in blue, Loddington's in red, and the different systems. So you can see at Loddington generally has a higher organic matter storage capacity compared to Lenham, which again on that heavier soil you would expect. And again, the system 1 and 2, sustainable systems 1 and 2, have a higher ability for cycling the organic matter, so basically greater activity compared to at Lenham, where things are a bit more similar, so slightly lower storage of organic matter, but also more similar cycling of the organic matter as well. At Loddington, where we've been able to look at the sort of activity and stability of the tea bags over the 4-year period, we can see over the 4 years that we've seen a general stability has improved, but activity year to year is still quite variable, and that's basically really driven by the weather. Obviously, the sort of moisture levels of the soil, the temperature of the soil, all have big drivers of that microbial population and the dynamics of it cycling and breaking down those tea bags. We also look at soil greenhouse gas emissions, and we look at basically the CO2 equivalent in terms of the emissions, and that we basically include obviously the CO2, but we also measure methane and nitrous oxide, because we know obviously methane and nitrous oxide are more potent greenhouse gases than CO2. So when we look at the overall impact, we look at the equivalence of them in terms of total CO2. And we can see here, this is the average across the two sites over the period. We can see between the conventional and the sustainable system 2, we see a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases, partly due to lower soil disturbance, driving basically reduced emissions from particularly CO2. However, there are variations across the sites and the fields. So we can see here in 2019, this is again an average across the two sites. We saw quite low levels of CO2 equivalent in all three systems. In 2020, we saw a much higher level, and that again is weather driven. And then when we look at Loddington and Lenham in 2020, we can see here that Loddington, it's more stable. We do see the higher soil gas emissions from the conventional system, and a reduction, but similar in sustainable system 1 and 2. However, at Lenham, there's much more variability year to year, and in 2020 we actually saw greater greenhouse gas emissions from the sustainable system 1 and 2, and we believe that is maybe due to the wet and lighter soil, basically. So the lighter soil is at risk of slumping, and then obviously when it's slumping, it basically has lower porosity, lower spaces for air, and that can lead to anaerobic conditions. And anaerobic conditions in a wet winter, which was what we saw in the 2020, does lead to nitrous oxide emissions, which is hence why we see these greater emissions in those systems. So I say overall, in terms of the environmental sustainability, we do see these variations because of the soil type and because of the seasonal effect and the weather, which is a big driver. But we do see improvements in those systems compared to a conventional system, both in terms of the sort of environment, the biodiversity, so looking at worms, looking at the bird sightings, but also in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint. And overall, as this is sort of bringing in the total measures that we're looking at, and looking at the trends across both sites, as Belinda mentioned, in terms of the crop establishment and crop performance, we see those slight differences between the two soil types, and particularly at Loddington being that heavier soil type. Really, the weather does have a greater impact on yield performance. But when we start to account for the sort of productivity side and the efficiency in terms of fewer field passes, greater fuel savings, then obviously that in terms of the financial net profit still favours the sustainable system. And in terms of sort of environmental footprints and the sort of soil health, we do see favourable benefits from the sustainable systems. But again, it's sort of a short time period in terms of the overall sort of history of the soils. Soils take a long time to change, and really what we're understanding here is sort of that how resilient those soils are to particular drivers, and weather in particular, and how we can farm those within the constraints of the production systems we have. So thank you very much.